Okay, we really need to talk about what's going on in Germany. Now, before we do, a little bit of background. The German curve inverted just a tiny, slightly little bit way back in September. Seems like ancient times now, but remember September? There was a lot going on. Much of it was focused on London and the UK, the gilt market, but really there was all sorts of financial chaos and economic concerns, economic uncertainty at that time in September. German curve inverted, which was one of those things that got your attention and said, this stuff is starting to get serious. And when I say unprecedented inversion, I mean the German curve in its euro denominated incarnation, so going back to 1999. And the German curve had only inverted previously just a tiny little sliver on just a single day back in 2008. So already you make those comparisons. Oh, it hasn't inverted since 2008, and you're starting to pay close attention. But what followed, we went from unprecedented little bit of inversion in September to holy cow. The entire German marketplace really upended. And what's more important, what's more meaningful, is when it did. Late October into November, specifically after the US CPI report for the month of October was released in early November. You can see it on the chart. The German curve completely flips around. And over the next several months, what had been a tiny unprecedented inversion became an enormous, even more unprecedented inversion. One that looked like the old Germany under Deutschmarks way back when, in either the reunification crisis or the 1970s and early 1980s, which were never good periods. But then, just recently, we've gone from tiny unprecedented to holy cow to this has gotten really surreal. This has gone completely crazy here. I'm kind of at a loss for words, which is difficult for someone like me who uses lots of words often to try to describe these things. Now, last week, the ECB raised it or voted to raise its three benchmark rates. The ECB puts together what they call a money market corridor. On top, something called the marginal lending facility, which they raised from 275 to 325. Their main target rate, or the midpoint, the MRO, or the main, or what's the rate for main refinancing operations, that went from 250 to 3. And the floor, what's supposed to be the floor, is the deposit account, which went from 2 to 2.5%. You can think of the deposit account like the Fed's RRP, or actually the Fed's RRP was meant to mimic the ECB's deposit account. But either way, it's supposed to put a floor under money market rates. These new 50 basis points higher corridor, all three benchmarks, became effective on Wednesday. Now, if you go back to the rate hike in December, the last time the ECB raised rates, what happened was bond rates, German rates were incredibly low. The ECB rate hikes were voted on. The bond market didn't move. But then the new rates, the new corridor became effective, and then you saw German rates pop up. So I was kind of expecting the same thing to happen this week. German rates were already low. The ECB voted. Market did not make no reaction in Germany. The rates became effective on Wednesday and nothing. German rates didn't move. And then yesterday, thought, okay, maybe it was delayed reaction, and rates actually fell yesterday. And then today, German yields are back up a little bit, but they're lower than they were on Wednesday. To the point now that the entire German curve, or nearly the entire German curve, almost all of it from the 2-year on down, is below the deposit rate floor. Yes, I realize these are bond rates and not money rates, and so it's not directly comparable, just like in the U.S. market, the U.S. Treasury long-term rates are below the RRP. That's my point. The German government curve is now thoroughly treasuryed. So what the hell does this mean? Like I said, this is nuts. This is bananas. This is entirely surreal, especially given how either soft landing fever has attacked much of the mainstream, or this idea of transitory disinflation where, given how energy prices rebounded in January, we're about to get into another 2022 style effect of consumer prices again. And here we have the German market telling you, no, this is something else entirely. And doing so in a way that reminds us of some some really bad stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about the rest of today. But first, I'm Jeff. This is Eurodollar University. Thank you very much for joining me and tuning in for all of this money and macro stuff. And if you want more money and macro stuff, I've got memberships available for you where we get to background detail. What is money in this system? What do curves mean? How do we interpret these things? Memberships available at Eurodollar University. Got subscription services, a daily briefing I do that's partnership with Markets Insider Pro. I believe there's a deal, a special going on there, but it may not be true. You need to check out the details for sure. And a daily deep dive analysis at Eurodollar.University, where we dive deep into all of these things because they are worth diving deep into. Stop taking people's word for it. Stop listening to central bankers. We need to look at evidence and evaluate things on our own. All of those things available at Eurodollar.University. So as I said, Germany, curves, absolutely bonkers. This is bananas here. But what does it mean? Well, in one sense, it means what it always means. German inversion, U.S. Treasury inversion, Canadian bond curve inversion. Right, Mike, my friend in Canada? Bond curves inverted literally means the market is expecting rates to go down. Why does the market expecting rates to go down over time? Usually that's associated with the types of conditions which we call a recession. It means some form of economic distress which leads either growth and inflation expectations to fall, which you would expect in a economic contraction, or in combination with central banks eventually realizing that situation and lowering their benchmark rates, which is where Germany is right now. Incredibly certain that rates are going to go lower, even as the ECB continues to say rates are going to go higher, just like the Fed and U.S. Treasury. This is a global phenomenon here, which is something that really should be ringing alarm bells. This is not specifically about Germany. So I'm going to talk about a paper today that was written a few years back in 2019. The last time we had inversion mania, when the yield curve started to invert, the Treasury yield curve started to invert in 2019. This was a paper written, it's called Is a Recession Imminent? The Signal of the Yield Curve, by a trio of researchers from the National Bank of Belgium. Gotta love the Belgians for this. And it's interesting how they begin their paper, because they begin their paper kind of the way I would, which is recognizing how most economists and central bankers, every time the yield curve inverts, they say, nah, it means nothing. Here's what they write. Experience shows that commentators tend to downplay the signals given by the yield curve. In fact, when asked the question in 2007, 2000, 1990, and on earlier occasions, most economists indicated that, quote, this time is different, meaning that this time the yield curve inversion will not be followed by recession. Yet, a recession occurred every time. And this time was not different in 2019 on both counts. In 2019, the yield curve in the U.S. inverted. Economists said, nah, this time is different. Jay Powell said, well, maybe there's something to it, but we don't buy into that stuff. A few policymakers like Neil Kashkari said, I'm a little worried about this, but by and large, if you go back and look at all the media articles that were written, especially those taken from central bank policymakers, what they said was, yep, this time is different. Except that time wasn't different. Now, we don't know for sure in the United States because COVID came along just at that particular moment when it looked like the U.S. was going to fall into recession, but we do know about all these places around the rest of the world, including Europe, which fell into recession before we got to COVID. I already talked about recently not the Bank of Japan, but the country of Japan, which found out many years later, oh yes, our recession began in October of 2018. So there was recession throughout the global economy in 2019, and the yield curve pegged it. But the German curve hadn't been inverted in 2019, nor had it been inverted leading up to the 2011-2012 recession back then. So what is going on with specifically Germany or yield curves in particular? Why is the signal so much stronger now? Well, now that this paper didn't go into that, we'll talk about that in a minute. What this paper focused on was how many excuses and rationalizations are offered in order to deny what is really a very clear signal of recession. As they recall, the authors recall, central banks often contribute to downplaying the signals of the yield curve. Regarding the forecast made by central banks in the yield curve, we note an interesting analogy. While central banks are sometimes compared to the Delphic oracle, the yield curve can be compared to Cassandra, the princess who was given the gift to see into the future, but was cursed to never be believed. That's exactly where we are over the last year. Remember, last March, the yield curve in the U.S. Treasuries inverted in a very small way back in March, and Jay Powell said, nope, we don't pay attention to that. We pay attention to the near-term forward spread. Then what happened? The yield curve spread, the yield curve inversion spread down the curve. Eventually, that near-term forward spread inverted too, back at the same time. All of this stuff was going on in Germany. Where you see the German curve completely change its character is exactly the same moment when the near-term forward spread on the Treasury curve inverted. So the Fed said this time is different, and instead, this time doesn't appear to be different, at least in terms of curve behavior, and more curves are joining in on the same party. Now back to our Belgian paper, where our authors note some famous examples of those saying this time is different. Most famously of all, the maestro, which I say ironically every time I use it, because that was a media construction, not any level of proficiency and knowledge. Alan Greenspan notoriously declared in 2005 before the U.S. Senate Banking Committee that, quote, the evidence very clearly indicates that the yield curve's efficiency as a forecasting tool has diminished very dramatically. Yeah, it didn't. Not to be outdone, Greenspan was joined by his immediate successor, none other than one Ben Bernanke, who in 2006 declared, quote, I would not interpret the currently very flat yield curve as indicating a significant economic slowdown to come, because it wasn't a significant economic slowdown to come. It was a nasty, nasty recession that was right around the corner, whose seeds were already being sown as Bernanke, the clueless, was talking at that moment. Now, the purpose of the paper, as I said, was to go over all of these rationalizations and excuses, or many of the mainstream ones, about why we should not pay attention to the yield curve, why people always say this time is different. And in the 2010s in particular, the era of QE, what most people say is we can't trust long-term rates because the Fed or the ECB buys those bonds and spoils the signal. In the parlance of econometrics, they mess around with term premiums. Now, I'm not going to get into term premiums here. Number one, it really is a waste of everyone's time, but occasionally we do have to go over it because term premiums is something that economists talk about. So if you want to know what they're getting wrong, you kind of have to speak their language. But we're not going to do that here. I've talked about term premiums before, and I'm absolutely sure we're going to talk about term premiums again, and I'll hold my head doing it. But essentially, term premiums are a get-out-of-jail-free card as far as economists and policymakers go, because they use term premiums to avoid having to confront uncomfortable truth. That being said, our enterprising Belgian researchers in this paper showed that whether you add term premiums or not, it doesn't seem to change the predictive power of the yield curve. Here's what they say. However, there is no decisive empirical evidence showing that the slope of the yield curve should be adjusted for the term premium. In fact, models including the term premium tend to obtain better results in forecasting recessions, although the difference compared to models excluding the term premiums is not statistically significant. So the numbers look a little bit better when you add term premiums. We don't really know if it makes any difference or not. At least the researchers in the language of econometrics and regressions, they can't say for sure that term premiums make a difference. So if you're saying we can't rely on the slope of the yield curve to predict recessions because term premiums are very different, R star and all that stuff, what they're saying is really there's no evidence to believe that. So what we're left with is basically what we began with. That anybody saying this time is different, the burden of proof, the burden of just explaining yourself is on you, not the yield curve. The yield curve has proven itself time and time and time again in the face of, as they mentioned in the introduction, every single time the yield curve inverts, you can bet your worthless dollar or your worthless euro, Deutsche Mark, or whatever it might be, that some policymaker is going to say, nah, that can't happen. Why? Because policymakers have every incentive to tell you the story that is favorable to the economy and the markets, because that reflects upon themselves. The last thing that the Fed wants to do, or the ECB wants to do, is say, yeah, we believe the yield curve. We're going to lead you into this massive recession. Of course they're not going to say that. They're going to pretend that everything is fine until everything is not fine, or until it is so absolutely perfectly clear and obvious that everything is not fine. And that's really where we get into the current inversions. The current inversions are basically saying there is absolutely almost near certainty. There's never near certainty, but as much predictive power as possibly available, the highest probability in an uncertain, dynamic, complex marketplace where this is going to happen. At some point, central bankers who believe inflation is the biggest risk to each economy and want to continue hiking rates, the market is starting to ignore those rate hikes because it believes at some point those central bankers are going to go, oh, inflation was not the biggest risk. In fact, it isn't recession. It isn't inflation, it's recession. And the level of inversion in these curves, particularly the German curve, which is completely surreal, as I said, what that means is the level of confidence in that scenario has gone through the roof, to the point that long-term yields are now less than the current deposit rate floor, let alone the midpoint. Way less. Big change in the curves, even though in January we've got this spike in, or this rebound in energy prices, this talk of transitory disinflation. We've got soft landing fever, which depends in part upon Europe avoiding the worst case, which these markets have completely ignored and said, we forecast the worst case. Maybe not the worst of the worst case. Let's say it differently. Let's say it more specifically. We're forecasting a lot of downside cases which don't preclude the worst cases. So maybe it means 2008 style recession. Maybe it means something more than that. But again, my overriding point here, this is not just about Germany. Even if it was, that would be bad enough, because you have an engine in the middle of the European economy, which the rest of the world is depending upon to at least avoid the worst case. And here it is sputtering along to the point that its markets are doing this. That's already bad enough, but this is not just about Germany. We see the same type of behavior in every market around the world, or nearly every market around the world. Enough of them that you say, yeah, no, this isn't going to go well. And markets are so confident about it. And central bankers are so arrogant in saying this time is different, realizing that by saying so, they're sort of making it exactly the same in every single respect. So we need to pay attention to what's going on in Germany, because it's gotten completely bananas. What does that mean? We'll find out soon enough. I'm Jeff. This is Eurodollar University. Thank you for joining me. As always, an enormous, huge, sincere thank you to all the Eurodollar University Markets Insider Pro research subscribers, and huge love to the Eurodollar University members, all of them. I can't thank you all enough. So until next time, do take care.